So, welcome everybody to Aquifer's Educator to Educator webinar. Today we're going to be talking about lessons learned for COVID, and I will have to say that we're still learning as we go, and sharing best practices for using Aquifer in virtual courses. So I am so happy to be here. I'm Sherilyn Smith. I'm the Chief Academic Officer for Aquifer, Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I'm the Clinical Skills Learning Specialist there. I am joined by some fantastic educators today. Dr. Traci Marquis-Eydman, who's the Assistant Dean for Faculty Engagement, as well as a Longitudinal Integrated Clerkship Director and Associate Professor of Family Medicine at Quinnipiac University. Dr. Mourad is an Associate Professor of Medicine at Case Western University and the VA Hospital, both in Cleveland. Cynthia Lord is the Associate Professor and Founding Director of the Physician Assistant Program at Case Western University. And Dr. Nackers is an Assistant Professor of Pediatrics and the Director of Pediatric Undergraduate Medical Education at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And we are so happy to have a medical student with us today, Georgia Vasilakis. I told her that I would probably stumble over that. Awesome last name. And she is joining us from West Virginia University. So we've got a great panel today and looking forward to all of the things that they're going to share. I do receive salary support for my role at Aquifer. And here are our learning goals. So we're really going to focus on sharing some advice from all of the great panelists that you just heard about how they manage learning disruptions due to COVID. And what lessons have they learned, and what are they going to take forward? And then we're going to end at the very end of the webinar by highlighting some of the tools that are there for you to really optimize your own use of Aquifer learning tools. So I'd like to start with a poll here, and this is really a check-in for you all. So we'll open up the poll, and it's a rating of sort of how are you feeling today? Is our poll open? Great. On a scale of 1 to 5, with the 5 being I've got this, how are you feeling? Everybody can, vote for what feels good for you. We'll give it a minute or so. All right, if we can close the poll and see what we've got. All right, so at least one person feels like they've got this, and I will say that we hope by the end of this webinar, that everybody will feel a little bit closer to that I've got this with all of the great advice that people are giving. So here's our agenda. So we're doing an introduction right now, and then we're going to spend a good amount of time really hearing from all of the panelists that I introduced, and then spend about 10 minutes with answering your questions, and then have a final wrap-up about some other resources that are available to you. So a few logistics notes. Please put your questions in the Q&A panel. There's an option for Q&A as well as chat. And we will take those questions and answer them in the question and answer session. So there are a few of you here today who really don't know a lot about Aquifer. And I wanted to give a brief overview of Aquifer and kind of what's been happening during the COVID disruption. So Aquifer is a not-for-profit, and our mission is to deliver the best healthcare education through collaborative development and research into innovative, high-impact virtual teaching and learning methods. And we've been doing this for more than 20 years, and we don't do this alone. We work with a great group of educators. This is our educator consortium, and more than 65 educators come together. They're from all different disciplines. We have physicians, MDs, DOs, we have basic scientists, anatomists, biochemists, we have physician assistants and nurses who all work together to really make sure that there's high quality content and that the pedagogy that we use is up to date and our assessment tools are validated and useful to you. And so when I think about our cases and what Aquifer is, we really focus on developing clinical reasoning skills. And for those of you who really haven't been into a case, as students work through it, we begin with the history, they work through physical exam, differential diagnosis, come up with a diagnostic and evaluation plan, and then really practice management, all in a safe learning environment. And we really focused on making sure that there's really deep, high-quality content, that we support student knowledge acquisition, and that we model behavior that we hope every clinician would have. And I think that it's all through the lens of developing those clinical reasoning skills. And one of the reasons that I like this is that when you get into the clinic and you're on the wards or you're in a busy clinic, sometimes you don't have time to stop and pause and really do this deep dive. So we really think that this is a great preparation to be an excellent practitioner. And so what happened during this last year as COVID really disrupted medical and healthcare professions education? We provided free access to all of our content through June 30th, and almost 500 programs were served. And just in April alone, more than 500,000 cases were completed. So students really dove in. And we knew that based on what pandemics do, that it would not be all over by June. And so we created a grant program, and we awarded more than $1.2 million to a large number of programs so that they could have access to all of the content to help their students. And we've heard from students during this time that the Aquifer cases are really valuable. I think that that's an important thing for everybody to know, that while they are not the same as real patients, they really are a really great substitute and really support student learning during this time. And so, you know, in reflecting back, we ask people who use Aquifer, like, how do they use this? And as it turns out, we surveyed a large, number of you all in January before the pandemic. And at that time, the most common, as you can see here, use of Aquifer cases was independent study. It was required. The students did this on their own, and there were some people that used it for lecture materials, remediation support, but that was by far the most common way to go forward. We found out as we asked people as we were beginning to open up our grants program, like, what did you do during the pandemic? And I would say that educators got really creative, as you all know. They expanded Aquifer use in the existing courses. They created new courses based on Aquifer. And then a large portion began to push Aquifer down into the preclinical didactic phase because those preclinical students weren't able to see patients at all. So really using that clinical reasoning and exposure to core content was important. And then, we know that this, again, we knew that this was not going to be all over in June, and you all knew it too. And so we asked, what do you think is going to be the impact on your programs? And you can see here that people were very worried about reduction of clinical sites, insufficient training, clinical training for students, shortage of PPEs, shortage of patients that were suitable for students. And so that's kind of what the landscape was like in July, and you all were looking forward. And so this is just a summary slide of what has happened to date, and really a lot of use of the Aquifer cases, and we are looking forward to, I'm looking forward to hearing how that actually rolled out with all of our great educators today, and we were just so glad that we were here to help people. So with that background, again, we've got another poll for the people who are in the audience. You saw what people thought was going to happen in the time between June or July and December. And so now if we can open this poll, what I really am interested in is finding out what you guys are thinking about going forward. So, you know, choose all that apply. Which do you expect to have an impact on your program between now and July of this coming year? So maybe if we close the poll and then we can see what people said and see how that sort of reflects what we knew before. All right. Lots of people worried about quarantining, impacting learning. That's a new one that's that's emerged. So it's good that people are feeling like there's probably going to be PPE, I hope, but it really gives us a snapshot. So thank you. All right. So now what I'd like to do is turn to our panelists and hear, and I'm going to be driving the slides. So, we're going to hear about innovations and challenges and lessons learned. So I'm going to start with Cindy Lord, take it away, Cindy.
Well, thank you, Sherilyn, and good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to present the Case Western Reserve University PA program Tele-precepting curriculum. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? Well, as you know, COVID has limited sites and experiences. The census is down at many sites, leading to decreased volume. Elective surgeries are being canceled left and right. Sites have closed, and students and preceptors are out of clinical due to COVID infections. So our tele-precepting curriculum is designed to be used to augment rotations with decreased in-person hours, to enhance learning in rotations with decreased volume, and to provide educational experience for students who are not in an in-person rotation until we can get them back into direct patient care. So sometimes students are in for 2 weeks, out for 2 weeks, so we're using it there as well. The goal of our tele-precepting curriculum is to simulate traditional precepting during a rotation as closely as possible. Next slide. So we meet via Zoom twice a week. We recruit preceptors in their specialty areas, and students work through the Aquifer cases while preceptors facilitate the discussion and expand to add pearls and gems from their own clinical cases. They meet twice a week per 4-week rotation, and we do 2-hour sessions. The Aquifer cases are pre-identified by faculty lead, and they're sent to the students 2 to 3 days prior to the session. So examples of cases, so for instance, we're right now focusing on the disciplines of women's health, primary care, and emergency medicine, though we're probably going to expand that. So for instance, in women's health, we're using family medicine case number 32, that's one of the cases we're using, but it's an example. It's a 33-year-old female with painful periods. For primary care, one of the Aquifer cases we're using is internal medicine number 18, which is a 75-year-old male with memory problems. And one of the cases we're using in our emergency medicine tele-precepting is the Aquifer internal medicine number 2, which is a 60-year-old female with chest pain. So prior to the Zoom session, the student preps the H&P only. Then live during the tele-precepting session, the student presents their H&P in their own words. They cannot use or repeat what Aquifer has in the case. And then they develop an initial differential and they rank it based on their H&P. Then they identify appropriate diagnostics like labs, imaging, or other tests they'd want to order. And what the preceptor does is they provide the results of the diagnostics, and they can also share other images or resources for illustration purposes and to enhance learning. So guidelines, diagnostic criteria, something from cases they've seen, imaging, etc. The student then re-ranks their differential, like what can be ruled in, what can be ruled out, and then they identify the treatment plan and next steps like follow-up, referral, admission, etc. Post the live session, the student then submits a SOAP note, and they develop 5 self-identified learning objectives or learning opportunities based on knowledge gaps that the student self-identifies. Then when they meet on the second session of that week, the preceptor reviews and provides formative feedback on the SOAP note, which is later graded by the faculty. The student presents their 5 learning objectives, and then the preceptor reviews and discusses the learning objectives with the student and provides, live in real-time feedback to the student. The preceptor evaluation of the student is completed by the preceptor at the end of day 2 of the session, and it's based on 2 major categories: clinical skills and professional behavior. Next slide. Our outcomes, students evaluate the session on days 1 and 2, and then they also complete a self-evaluation of their performance. And then preceptors evaluate the students and they evaluate their experience. Student feedback's been very positive, and they note things like the preceptors are live and that they make them think on their feet. They probe the student's knowledge. They add pearls from their own experience. And then preceptor feedback has been equally good. They love doing it. They find the experience fun and rewarding. A little nervous at first, but they do enjoy it. And we've also found that it serves as a good preceptor development. So similar to students, it provides safe space learning for our preceptors as well. Next slide. I've just provided you just an example of 2 of the evaluations we use. So our tele-preceptor evaluation of students, we have a 3-point Likert assessment: achieves expectation, achieves but needs improvement, and unsatisfactory. And it's based on both program-defined skills like history, physical, SOAP note, etc., as well as our program-defined professional behaviors: commitment to learning, time management, organization, interpersonal interactions, etc. The overall grading rubric of the tele-precepting experience is 3 parts. 70% of the grade is the session participation, so history, physical, final differential diagnosis, final diagnosis, etc. 20% is the written communication, and 10% is oral communication, which is their defined learning objectives. The student evaluation of the tele-precepting is based on workload quality, quantity, diversity, preceptor attitude, willingness to teach, format, authenticity, the ability to enhance their critical learning and clinical reasoning skills, and to reflect on their feedback. Next slide. And so what have we learned? Well, first off, assign the cases to the students at least 2 to 3 days ahead of time so they have time to read and prep. Be sure to select appropriate cases and coordinate those cases with preceptors. Conduct a formal orientation for preceptors. We actually also developed a 30-minute video, so for those preceptors that can't attend the live session. And then have a timekeeper so you can get through 4 cases in 2 hours while creating a balanced, interactive learning environment. So now I'd like to pass the baton to Dr. Marquis-Eydman.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for having me. So our work happened at the Frank H. Netter-MD School of Medicine. And interestingly, my focus was on the transition from the preclinical years to the clinical years and the professional development. We'll call them opportunities for students. As we all know, this is a very challenging time for students when they shift from preclinical to clinical years. They are changing their learning culture and their learning environment. They are switching from gathering basic facts to application of knowledge. Their approach to studying and their approach to learning and mastering content shifts dramatically. And they're also figuring out where and how they fit in on a team. And so this was my focus pre-COVID. And then you throw in some COVID on top of that. And then the challenge was that we were on hold for our clinical placements from March until June. And our LIC students in Maine were starting at exactly the same time as they were able to return to clinical duties. And so we had these challenges as far as, physical space, social distancing, and being able to get them into the hospital setting. So what I wanted to do was make the professional development piece of the orientation much more robust and honor the usual orientation content at the same time, and also have this challenge of social distancing and physical space at the same time. Next slide, please. So my answer was to go hybrid or go home, so to speak. And so we decided to go hybrid. And what hybrid means for us is that we had a mixture of in-person sessions, which still honored all of the traditional items. But then we also had the professional development piece, which was enhanced. And that's where Aquifer was extremely helpful. They could do that part asynchronously on their own time. We gave them 10 days or so to complete the modules. There were 15 modules that were required and 23 that were optional. The other hybrid part of this course was that it was a professional development section, and then there was also a clinical reasoning section. The professional development section was focused on cultural humility and cultural awareness, patient safety and how to avoid medical errors, high value care, practicing their oral presentation skills, which may have been a bit rusty since they were on break from having clinical exposures, and focus on advanced communication skills. And then the in-person orientation piece was also more specific to the site itself and to longitudinal learning. Next slide, please. So overall, the outcome was extremely positive. The students felt appreciative that they could do some of these things on their own time as they were adjusting to a large move from Connecticut, where our medical school is based, to this site, which is in northern Maine, or 10 hours away. So they appreciated having some flexibility in that time and space. They felt like they were more prepared for the wards, so to speak, because they got some of that clinical reasoning stuff brushed off, and they felt like they weren't as rusty in that department. And it also, interestingly, which we hadn't planned on as a bonus, but it became a bonus, is it gave us time for content that was best delivered in person that we probably wouldn't have been able to do if we hadn't done this asynchronous portion of the professional development. So it allowed us to get them recertified in BLS. It gave us time to sit down with them one-on-one with expectations for professionalism in each of the separate clerkships. It gave us time to get them some focused EMR training. So when they got to the floors, they felt comfortable with the EMR system. We got them fit tested for N95s. We did some really fun suture workshops, some OR training, a couple of sim lab sessions, and some procedure training. So all those things probably wouldn't have fit in our schedule, but now we had time to do that. A second bonus for us was it gave time for the students to just sit and talk with the faculty, and for each of those groups of people to get to know each other as people. So I think when they started their clinical rotations post-orientation, they already had a foundation of a relationship with the faculty, which is so important for mentoring. So we were very happy with that bonus as well. Next slide. So lessons learned for us is hybrid works. It's okay to have some of one and some of the other. The other lesson learned is that we may want to have fewer modules next time. So I think that the third years, because of that transition from second year to third year and all the other pieces that can be overwhelming, they may have been overwhelmed by the volume. And then the other thing is the importance of following up. So for future iterations, my intention is to have a session where I sit down with the students and make sure that we highlight key concepts and learning points and facilitate that conversation to make sure that those points really hit home, especially in things like cultural humility, high value care. Those are very important concepts to have prior to starting on the wards. So we're very excited about that. Next slide, please. As a bonus, I was asked to share with you all that we were able to match all of our required teaching topics for each of the 6 clerkships against cases in Aquifer in preparation for the risk of quarantine students or quarantine preceptors. We actually have had to use these already with an unexpected absence of a preceptor who wasn't able to deliver their didactic in person. The students were assigned those modules, and then there was follow-up the week after to make sure that key points were hit there. And that I have that list available. I've given it to Aquifer, and if anyone's interested in that, I'm happy to share. The slide previous also had a picture of my blog, and if anyone is interested in looking at the list of topics that I selected for the professional development piece for orientation, you can access that through the blog as well. So next, we will move on to Dr. Nackers.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health, and my role there includes serving as a course director for an integrated course. Our curriculum is a little bit different in that we talk about it in 3 phases, and our phase 2 of the curriculum is comparable to a traditional M3 year with all of those required clerkship experiences. But our students enter that phase of training in January of their second year, so about a semester earlier than a traditional 4-year curriculum. And so I include that to say that our challenge and the time that I'm going to be talking about was back in March when this was really all kicking off. And we had a group of students who had only been in the clinical year, that first clinical year of their training. They had just entered that about 10 weeks prior. And now we were faced with the situation of students not being able to participate in face-to-face patient care in our clinical settings. And what were we going to do with them for this time? Our curriculum also, that M3 year or phase 2 component, consists of 4 big integrated blocks. And the one that I oversee, and I'll show you some examples from, is called Care Across the Life Cycle, and is sort of like a pediatrics and OBGYN clerkship combined, also with geriatrics thrown in there. And so what our phase 2 group decided to do as a group was to create this online interim course that ended up being 12 weeks long. And we took the weekly case-based learning sessions out of each of our blocks, added some public health content to that as well, and created it as this online course. However, as you can imagine with case-based learning, having that clinical context is really helpful. And so now we're trying to do this for these clinical students who are still very early in the clinical portion of their training without that clinical context. So if we could go to the next slide. So as I said, what we did was we took the case-based learning sessions from our existing clinical courses, and we created just a recurring weekly schedule. So then public health content was scheduled on Monday, and then each of the 4 courses had a day that was assigned to them where the students would gather online with facilitators to work through the cases. And Aquifer was one of the very helpful tools that we used, both to help provide clinical context for students before the CBL so they could simulate some relevant clinical experiences using the Aquifer cases. And then it also was an opportunity to help students apply that knowledge, that new knowledge, then after they've completed the CBL. So if we could go to the next slide. So one of the examples from my course, many of the CBLs in my course, we use them as an opportunity to compare and contrast problems or disease conditions across the different patient populations in our integrated block. And so we have this fever case, and the pre-work included some basic readings and curricular materials that we have made at our institution. But we also gave them some cases, including Aquifer Pediatrics case number 10, which is a fever case. And actually an activity that I had seen presented at a previous conference that's going to be forthcoming. There's some new Aquifer integrated illness scripts, and part of that is a mechanism of disease map. And so I, inspired by that, had created this sort of worksheet to help our students apply basic science knowledge related to fever as well. Then we met online. We worked through a series of cases and discussion questions with faculty facilitators. And then included in the post-session application activities had a whole host of cases. And so some from geriatrics and internal medicine to represent geriatric patients. There was an internal medicine STD case that worked well to represent our GYN patients, and then several of the pediatric cases as well. On the next slide, I have a slightly different example. One of our other topics is abuse, neglect, and mandated reporting, and it's focused on things like child abuse and neglect, and then also contrasting reporting requirements for adults with and without capacity, and so issues of domestic violence, intimate partner violence for our OBGYN examples, and then elder abuse, elder neglect for our geriatrics examples. Our pre-work similarly, in this case, was mostly readings and videos that we had created or curated previously. The case included a facilitated discussion, and the students also participating in role play activities, practicing taking a history around this more difficult topic, and then supplementing with post-session application activities, including several Aquifer cases from the geriatrics and pediatrics courses. And then this was one where if there is an Aquifer case, I didn't find it, but APGO has a curriculum called UWise and had some cases that we were able to supplement with there. If we can go to the next slide. So our outcomes, our students really gave us wonderful feedback on this, and our more formal internal course evaluation data suggests that the cases set up in this way, using Aquifer and other materials to help provide the clinical context. Really, students evaluated this similarly to how they do when these CBL sessions are integrated within our clinical clerkships. And students were also able to use the Aquifer cases to simulate some of the experience requirements. So the old ED2s, or now I believe it's LCME standard 6.2. Our faculty also really enjoyed this experience, both during the course and now. Our faculty are enjoying having less disrupted time on the clinical wards with the students because all of their CBLs are done. And we were successfully able to utilize faculty from across our entire regional campus. We have a clinical campus that extends across our state, and we're able to have faculty facilitators participate from all of our sites, which was really helpful, all hands on deck approach as the pandemic was going wild back in the spring, and was just nice to collaborate with some of those colleagues we don't see as often. Thanks. Next, I'm sorry, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Oh, I missed a slide. Apologies, friends. So my lessons learned on this, this really forced me to take a deeper dive into the Aquifer content across all of the available courses. As a course director for an integrated course, that's something I could have dug into sooner. And I was really glad to have the opportunity to do that and gain that additional exposure. And in hindsight, I think had I utilized the Aquifer feature to create a customized course and pulled all of the cases we were using together in that custom course, that may have made for a smoother experience for our students. And heaven forbid we have to do this again in 2021. That would certainly be a strategy that we could employ. And so next, I'll hand it off to Dr. Ronda Mourad.
Thank you very much. I'm here to talk, to focus a little bit on the preclinical uses for Aquifer. So Case Western Reserve University is a 4-hospital affiliate. So all of our preclinical students will be assigned to a clinical preceptorship at one of those 4 sites across different disciplines. Some might work in an ER, some are with a primary care physician or a surgeon in the community, the VA. So you might imagine these experiences are all going to be highly variable depending on how much time they have to complete a patient encounter, how much time that faculty member has to actually observe the clinical encounter, and how much time the faculty member will have to give them feedback in real time while they're still trying to juggle the clinical responsibilities for that day. So if the encounter isn't observed in its entirety, it would be difficult to assess whether pertinent information ends up missing from the patient's or from the student's SOAP note because they ran out of time to finish the physical exam or didn't take a thorough history, or if it was missing because the student could do those skills but just didn't know that that was pertinent to end up in the note. So those were just some of the challenges that would exist just even in the pre-COVID era. And then obviously during the COVID time, when students were completely removed from clinical venues, the new challenge was that there are no live patient encounters. Next slide, please. So this is something, as I said, we had been doing even pre-COVID in order to ensure all of our preclinical students had a basic standardized skill set of writing a SOAP note. So it didn't really matter that they had variable clinical preceptorships. We used this, in this case, it was a leg pain, leg swelling case in Aquifer to substitute as a standardized patient during a formative exercise of our communications block. So all their classmates were assigned to the same Aquifer case and told to write a SOAP note based on this encounter, which, as you've heard, mimics a pretty realistic interaction that a provider would have with a patient in real time. And this was considered a formative exercise. So faculty then would evaluate their notes, and this faculty member was different from the person assigned as their clinical site. Next slide, please. So some of the things that came out of this is, number one, students can really focus on one task at a time. When they're in the clinical setting, they're doing all these things, learning how to do an exam, learning how to take history, and then presenting a few minutes later an oral presentation. So in this case, you really can just focus. Today, we're going to focus just on the writing piece. The next thing, it really levels the playing ground for students who, again, because of the variability in their clinical sites, some may have had limited time for interactions or limited time for feedback, depending on how busy their attending was. So this really kind of levels the playing ground so that they're all evaluated just on the ability to write a note. We've heard faculty are a limited resource, and clinical venues are busy even pre-COVID. So this really allows the faculty to evaluate their skills, either their oral presentation or in this case, their writing skills, without having to actually be there to observe the clinical encounter. And then this also allows faculty to give more consistent feedback on the written note because it's based on a standardized case and consistent expectations for all students. In other words, all faculty evaluating the note have the same data and they know what was available to all the students based on this case. Next slide, please. So some of our lessons learned. What was useful pre-COVID became essential during COVID when clinical experiences were either eliminated or truncated. And this was actually true for our preclinical as well as you might imagine for our clinical clerkship students. The other thing I really want to make clear that we kind of learned over time, it's helpful to assign only the part of the case that's relevant to what you're trying to evaluate. So for a preclinical learner who's trying to figure out how to write a SOAP note and they have limited medical knowledge, you don't need to assign the entire, nor should you assign the entire case, because you really want them to only work on the parts that are relevant to writing a SOAP note. You don't need them to get lost in the weeds on the evidence behind different medications used to treat a DVT, for example. The other thing I wanted to point out, I know there's some program directors in the audience, and this can really be applied to learners of all stages. For example, if you need to remediate a struggling resident, somebody may have had a long gap between their UME and their GME training, or if you just want to make sure all your incoming interns come in with the same basic skill set at the beginning of training, Aquifer cases can be used that way. There are cases designated also specifically to understanding how to do an oral presentation as well, not just to use this for writing notes. The other thing I think, this I really didn't appreciate until COVID hit and faculty were pulled into clinical venues unexpectedly and couldn't necessarily be there to teach when we were scheduled to teach. So these exercises, our graduating MS4s were also quarantined at home and they were dying to help us as faculty. They really wanted to help give feedback to MS3s or to preclinical students. So the nice thing, since they don't have to be present for the clinical encounter, we could actually use our MS4s during elective time, or residents who want more exposure, learning how to be good teachers. They can actually sub in as faculty and evaluate these SOAP notes based on an Aquifer case. I think we all know nothing's going to replace the value of evaluating an actual patient in a real life clinical encounter, but Aquifer really allows us to substitute any gaps in our clinical venues or just really to function as a standardized patient. So with that, I will now hand it over to Georgia, who's going to give us her viewpoint of her experiences as a medical student.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mourad, and thank you all for having me. I was asked to speak today on my virtual rotation, which was block 1 for me, and speak to some challenges and some lessons that I learned as a student, and also maybe to help you all. So coming into my very first clinical rotation, I was coming right off of USMLE Step 1, all of the knowledge that I had packed in my brain, neatly filed, ready to put into action. And the night before everybody was supposed to start our clinical rotations, we were asked to quarantine to at least July 15th because of a Morgantown campus exposure that we had as a class. And then family medicine, which was my first rotation, had decided to keep us virtual for the whole month because that is what had worked for blocks 5 and 6. So that was the first struggle, not being able to go in. The second challenge I had was that we didn't really have that patient contact until we went to our rural rotation, which was still scheduled for August. And that was still up in the air at the time of starting. I will talk about how some of the virtual experiences we had in that month did not really correspond well with the reading or practice materials. And because we are still students, some of the parts that are not as fun about being a student is we still have to prepare for exams and those high-stake exams. So trying to figure out all of this in a new environment with a new way of learning all became a challenge for us. So our course structure in family medicine, next slide. Thank you, Dr. Smith. For our first 4 weeks was virtual learning. Our second 4 weeks was rural rotation. So the first 4 weeks, we were all assigned to do inpatient rounds with the family medicine team in the morning. And this was great to develop our oral presentation skills, to learn how the electronic medical record works, how to find information, and that was great. But I will note that the first, the original clerkship schedule only had us doing inpatient ward rounds for 1 week, and the other 3 weeks were outpatient care. And all of us know that inpatient care is very different than outpatient care. So when I went to my rural, even though I learned a lot about IV boluses and PICC lines and dosing and learning how to use electronic medical record, when I actually had my first live experience, I didn't meet a patient with a PICC line, and I did not, I didn't have those clinical skills necessary for ambulatory care yet. We also had faculty and student presentations sprinkled throughout the first month. And we also had 3 virtual standardized patients encountered via Zoom, where we were required to write 3 H&Ps and admission orders in sort of a timely fashion. And I talked about the rural rotation, which was our first live patient experience. And then the Aquifer cases, this is where it comes in, they were strongly encouraged. They were not graded, they were not required. But they were encouraged for us to complete in order to do well on the midterm exam, which was the Aquifer Family Medicine exam. Next slide, please. So the outcome, I passed the shelf, just in case anybody was worried. We passed it, and I'm not sure that, I haven't heard that anybody did not pass the shelf in my cohort, so that's great. The Aquifer exam that we used as our midterm was very challenging, and I don't have a problem sharing with you that I only got 2/3 of the questions correct. It was very challenging, but it showed me that Aquifer does this great thing where the questions are linked to specific cases. So it really showed me, okay, I got 0 of these questions right. I need to start here. And it allowed me to strategize how I was going to study for the next month. I also supplemented with the AAFP question bank. I don't know if many of you are familiar with that, but it's the family medicine question bank. There's over 1,000 questions there. So really, I was kind of pulling at straws between what was presented to us in lectures in this virtual environment, but also all these supplemental resources that I learned from word of mouth that would be great in this kind of time. The rural preceptor work, again, like I said, was my first live patient experience, and I felt somewhat prepared for rural, but because I had been in inpatient medicine mode for a month, it was a little bit harder to think, okay, well, what are patients really coming into the clinic for? They're not in an ICU bed. They're not getting Q2 neuro checks and things like that. And again, I think it's been said a lot that nothing can replace real patients, especially for developing the clinical skills. So I may have had a better knowledge base going into rural, but in terms of how I walk into the room and how my tone of voice is and all of those things that you practice and how I hold the stethoscope and how I ask for permission and things like that with the patient, those I think were not as developed by the time I went to rural. But Aquifer cases and the inpatient teams did allow for some protected time to think through the differential diagnosis when we're not on the spot. So, you know, a differential for pelvic pain, let's say, you can think of a wide range of things as to what could be causing pelvic pain. But when you're in your white coat and have your clipboard on wards, it's not as easy to think through those things in that kind of environment. So I was really thankful for that. Next slide, please. So lessons learned, and all 3 of these bullet points kind of relate to each other. And I think if I were in a clerkship director role, or if hopefully one day I can give back in this way, I would really try to look and see how all of the tools in our toolbox work, whether it's the Aquifer resources or any other resources, or even skills that you yourself know that you have. So you know what you do best. So if you're really good at making really interactive PowerPoints and presentations, do that. If you're going to use Aquifer, know which cases are, direct students to cases who are struggling and saying, here, read this section. I think we would have really benefited from that level of understanding in detail of the Aquifer cases, and that would have helped us. My second point, being intentional about student faculty touch points. I don't say this to be condescending. I say that I'm excited about that. We miss you. We miss walking into the clinic and walking past your office. We miss, the water cooler talk, so to speak. And if hindsight's 2020, sorry for the terrible joke, those are the things that you really don't think about that were really impactful. As many of us want to become like many of you, and especially for that mentor-mentee relationship, I know that was mentioned a few times. Whether the student is interested in the field or keeping an open mind, all of those mentors, regardless of the field, are really the things that we're going to remember, and not really necessarily the slideshow or the information. We're going to remember working with you. So those creating soft deadlines for assignments, as I've highlighted, or having that follow-up piece for the Aquifer cases would have been so amazing to have, especially in that first month. And I think to round it out, we have Dr. Smith.
Great. So I'm just going to, in the interest of time, I'm just going to say that as somebody who does remediation, I have leveraged a lot of the tools that you have heard from these other great educators. And my challenge is slightly different because everybody is stressed out if they come and talk to me. And then the USMLE clinical skills exam got, canceled. So there was a lot of uncertainty. And what I did was I created custom course, and I'll show you what it looks like. So following up on what Traci said about that's a great tool, as well as what Kirstin said. And then I assigned additional experiences to really scaffold the student learning with standardized patients, UWorld questions to really reinforce their learning. And this just gives you an idea about what it is. We put together, say, all cardiovascular or all pulmonary. And so people know what they're studying and what they're practicing on. And everybody actually improved their clinical skills when I do this with them. And so it is just so wonderful to see that. And everybody's confidence goes up and their stress goes down. So I think that those are big wins for everybody. And the things, And the things that I will take to get to forward, and just to give you a little pearl, is less is more. And so having a few cases that they dived in deeply, and then I know what is inside the case, so I can really help them build their differential diagnosis out based on what the case is really helpful. And then to let them innovate. I've had students who create illness scripts on their own to help them work. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn this over to your questions so we can answer what's on your mind.
Terrific. Thanks so much, everyone. So this is Eileen Oshesky. I'm the Director of Relationship Management here at Aquifer, and I'm here to bring your questions forward. We have just a few minutes. I'm sorry we're going to have to cut them a little bit short, but type them in the Q&A panel, and I can go ahead and bring them forward. So first is for Cindy. Cindy, we've had a couple of questions about your tele-precepting. People are wondering if you're using adjunct or full-time faculty, how you're able to recruit the preceptors to do this, and if you're doing this for your didactic and or your clinical curriculum. So I was wondering if you could answer that for us.
Sure. So right now we're doing it for our clinical curriculum. We're recruiting actual preceptors. So we have preceptors, some of them who are part-time, who have wanted to precept, but because of their work schedule, maybe they're only working part-time or whatever the schedule may be. We do have some core faculty just because they enjoy doing it. We had some of our graduates, some of our alumni, but the core are actually preceptors from emergency medicine. We have a couple OB-GYNs, and we have a couple, we have a primary care doc who's doing it, who are actually preceptors, and they have really felt it kind of a breath of fresh air. but we're using it right now in our clinical. Though I'm sitting here listening thinking, wow, we should have been doing this in our preclinical as well, in didactic.
That's great. Thank you so much. We've got another question. I don't know if anyone has an answer to this. And this came through during April to June 2020. Has anyone done 100% virtual course in a required clinical clerkship? And if so, a little curious about which one and successes or challenges.
So we did that at Netter. We had 100% virtual for one of our 6-week blocks. And it was a combination of, and I say 100% virtual, it was an abbreviated version. So there was a lot of didactics and independent asynchronous work, synchronous work. We also did what's called an ACE course, or an alternative clinical experience course, where it was almost like a clinical reasoning masterclass. And we also talked a lot about diagnostics and therapeutics in there, focusing on different organ systems. So not your traditional clerkship per se, but an alternative clinical experience that was entirely virtual.
Great. Thank you. Another question, and I believe, Traci, you might have an answer for this one as well, is any cases that can be used for orienting pre-med students to kind of clinical experience?
So we haven't used it for our pre-meds yet, but we definitely, I also run a continuity experience for year 1 and year 2 students. And our year 1 students, who they would have gone into their experiences this past fall, were not able to because of loss of clinical sites due to COVID. And so we did make a custom Aquifer course for them. And it dives a little bit into clinical reasoning, but they don't have the foundational knowledge yet to really explore that. And so I think the pre-meds would find some of those cases tough because they don't have the basic science knowledge yet. But I think that the cultural humility topics and conversations, the conversations about high value care, I think you can do some things with them, but I would just make sure that they're well facilitated post session.
Excellent. Thank you. Cindy, just quick yes, no question for you. Do you pay your preceptors?
No.
No. There we go. And Sherilyn, probably a question for you that might need to wrap us up. What are illness scripts?
So illness scripts are just, it's a way that, people think about knowledge, and it's students put together what's the key epidemiology, what are the core, clinical presenting factors that, what's the basic pathophysiology behind things. So students can put all of their knowledge together, and then it's ready access for them in their brains when they see patients. So that's what an illness script is.
Excellent. I'll close the Q&A by just answering one question myself online, which is, do preceptors have access to Aquifer like the core faculty, or does it cost? You can add all your preceptors within our system to access the cases as long as you're a subscriber. So all you need to do is go ahead into the user management panel and add them in, and all your preceptors can have access. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Dr. Smith, and I want to say a special thank you, Dr. Smith, for bringing your cat to the presentation. It's actually very nice to, it's actually lovely. So thank you, everyone, and back to you.
So in just wrapping up, thank you, panelists. We're so fortunate to hear all of your innovations. I think it's just so wonderful. I learned things from you, and I want to innovate like you do. In closing, I just want to highlight a few resources that are available in Aqueduct. So actually, if you log in to the cases, you can find there's an onboarding course to actually have you work through a case and what's in the pedagogy. Student resources and educator guides that go into pretty good depth, so you can know what the content is, and it's easy for you to find. So I really encourage you to go log in, and you can see up at the top onboarding resources, educator resources, and learning resources. And everybody here on this webinar mentioned these free courses, so high value care. So go check it out. They're great to interweave into other existing courses. We also have on our website the blog. So Traci mentioned that she's written a blog about some of her content. And so please check that out. We have on-demand for the webinars that we've covered before and some of the topics. There was some other group that did all virtual, and they shared their lessons learned from that. We have user stories and then some really great practical tips about how to get, how to use this searchable case library to be able to find the courses that you want, for instance. We do have people here, real human beings, ready to talk to you as well. So we're two great relationship managers, Kate Hancock and Leah Romano. They're here to really help you in any way that you want to integrate, to understand the resources. And if you'd like to talk to an educator, just shoot us a note through aquifer.org at peer consultations, and we will set up a time to talk to you. We know that there's some people who are not subscribers. Our website has a place for you to learn more about that. And realize that we will be back in 2021 with more webinars, with more educational offerings to help you all out. And I just want to end with a thank you again for making the time to be with us here today. And thank you to our panelists. And I hope that everybody has moved closer to that 5, I've got this, with all of this great education that we have today. So be well, thank you for sharing with us, and see you soon in the future.